have been considering for the past several weeks the becoming acquainted with the self, with the mechanical conditioning. And recently we have been disidentifying from the self, to be aware of the self as object, and that I as an observer reporting to X, that which is going on in the self, so that the self does not report in the name of I directly to X and set off all manner of unnecessary, unpleasant situations that are destructive or disintegrating to the state of being. Now, to further aid our observation, we will consider some levels of consciousness and some levels of being. And as we observe these, we may be possible to make an aim. Now, an aim is not a goal. A goal is to arrive at a certain place to achieve a certain result. An aim is a direction to go. So possibly we will consider that an aim might be to be able to see differently than we have heretofore seen in our conditioned state. And as we are observing, we will see differently. Now, the greatest obstruction to man using the teaching and possibly evolving into a different state of being, or having the ending of disintegration, which means exactly the same thing, is that the self-improvement concept, the self-improvement suggestion since the earliest days of one existence is very, very strong, the urge to be different. As we observe the self and begin to be acquainted with it, and we see some of the things in the self, a self-improving I attempts very strongly to get I, the observer, to identify with it and then start on a program of self-improvement. This is to fall back into the world. If one should discover that one has done so, it is not anything to be ashamed of, to regret. It is to say, I am awake and back on the job, and to be aware of that particular bit of conditioning. The teaching has that there are 4 basic levels of consciousness and many levels of being. So we will consider first the 4 general levels of consciousness. The first is sleep. When one is asleep in the bed, one is asleep under the influence of an anesthetic, one is asleep under the influence of toxicity in the body from adaptation, and one is in a state of coma. Now, in the state of sleep, obviously one is not responsible, one doesn't do very much, and only dreams go on, if anything, and some of the dreams are not recalled, some are recalled, but they are merely the not I's playing that are totally in sleep. But I is asleep, and I must sleep now and then. One finds that I uses tremendous amounts of energy in observing and must go to sleep now and then. However, it does not have to sleep for years, and it's been in a hypnotic sleep for many years, which is the second level of consciousness, is called waking sleep. In other words, the person appears to be awake, walks about, does all the daily chores, writes books, teaches college courses, performs surgery, repairs automobiles, cooks meals, builds buildings, and all sorts of things. But this is a walking sleep, or a waking sleep, because one is in a conditioned state and responds to the same mechanical responses. Buttons can be pushed. And the next state of consciousness is called self-awareness, or awareness of the self. It is paying attention to the self as object. It is the one we have recently started on, and it is a new state of consciousness. It is seeing self, or John, or Mary, as object. It is not condemning or justifying. It is an observer, simply to be aware of the self. Now, this is a new state of consciousness, a new state of looking at things, a new way of being, actually, from everything that we have ever known. We have always said I to everything. Now, that is the third level of consciousness. The fourth level of consciousness is called objective awareness or objective consciousness. I mean, one sees everything freely, without identifying with anything, without having any ideal to compare it to or to look through or anything. It is seeing everything objectively, reporting to X, and X does all the work. And this, of course, is a state of being that we may not experience, or a state of consciousness, I should say, that we may not experience for some time. Now, these states of consciousness are not something one can do. They are something one experiences as the various not-I's, the bits of conditioning, are rendered inoperative by X from the conscious paying attention to the self as an object. This is really the only thing one can do. The other states occur. Now, in the states of being, which are existent in each of these states of consciousness, there is more than one state of being under each level of consciousness. Under the level of sleep, there is coma, which can be brought about by toxicity or injury. There is bed sleep without dreams, and there is bed sleep with dreams, and possibly the state of consciously being aware of being asleep, however still physically asleep. So there is three basic states of being: coma, sleep without dreams, and sleep with dreams in the sleeping state of consciousness. Now, in the walking sleep, there is several layers of being. The first one is apathy, when one is totally under the control of suggestion, and the particular type of suggestion that says, what's the use? Everything will be miserable anyway. Now, if any of you have ever seen a demonstration of the hypnotic technique, you will somewhat know a little more about this. A person can be hypnotized and brought into a certain level of sleep, called somnambulistic, which is not real easy and usually isn't accomplished in the first many attempts at an operator to hypnotize a given subject. But it can be accomplished, and the person looks, for all appearances, as though everyone you see walking around. However, they're totally under the control of one operator. And whatever the operator suggests to the person, this is their state of being. If he suggests that they're paralyzed, they can't move. If he suggests that they are a very strong athlete, they can do unusual feats that is not possible to them in their usual waking state. When there is a conflict of interest, there is several hypnotists, all the not-I's working on them. And as one could tell someone they were in a very pitiful shape and they would sit down and be in a state of apathy, or one could say you are being very terribly mistreated and you must defend yourself, and they would be very angry. Now, the not-I's are hypnotists, and they have hypnotized I, kept it sound asleep, and it reports to X whatever the hypnotist has to say. And as there are many, there is ever-changing states. So the first state of being in the walking sleep, the lowest one, is called apathy. You may have seen people in apathy that you couldn't get a smile out of them no matter how hard you try. You cannot get them to be enthused about anything or interested in anything. They just moan. Even their flesh hangs. If they raise up an arm, the skin and the soft tissue hangs below the bone. Their whole face is dropped, their eyes look sad, and they're in a woe-begone situation. And of course, the physical body is functioning at that level and very erratically, and nothing seems to be functioning usually in it. The next level of being in the walking sleep state is that of fear. In fear, the person has become under the control of a not I that is suggesting every conceivable kind of dread things going to happen to it. This person believes in all sorts of catastrophes going to occur. Earthquakes are going to destroy us. Inflation is going to destroy us. Illness is going to strike me. I will probably come down with cancer or diabetes or some brain tumor or some other dread disorder. I'm afraid that we will be without a job and we won't have enough food to eat. I'm afraid the house will burn down. Not I gets one frightened. It can put one in a state of panic. You may have experienced it. More than likely have, and where it tells you that some terrible something's going to happen, and all of a sudden you seem to believe it. The heart races, the palms perspire. The person's in a state of anxiety from every direction. So this is fear. And the person who's been under the control of a fearful producing not I's over a period of time are usually generally considerable overweight. This is very simple because it's being reported to X that there is a great catastrophe going to happen very shortly, soon. So the appropriate thing to be done when there is going to be a catastrophe is to store up food and water. So every particle of nourishment that goes into the body is stored by X in response, and it is the appropriate thing to do if one is going to be attacked and in a very severe situation and unable to have food, so it is stored inside the body. Generally, these people are quite overweight, and they're quite sick because all the many things are occurring that in adaptation, because these terrible states do not occur very frequently. As an entire society becomes more under the control of suggestion of fear, we have more and more people decidedly overweight. Now, the next level of being in the walking state is called held resentment. It means really hate. It is a combination of fear and anger. The person is angry, feels they have been mistreated, but afraid to do anything about it. Now, this is a state of being wherein one is in a continual seething within inside, that one is constantly fighting in imagination. Sometimes there is violent killings in this imagination. Sometimes there is producing people all manner of difficulties. It is getting even with them. And in this state, tremendous energy, of course, is being burned up in imaginary fights. But X does what the information it receives, and the information being received from I that is hypnotized by the ideas of revenge, of hate, is continually drying the body up. So it is burned, all the excess. So this person is usually rather skinny, somewhat wrinkled up, and the face shows the signs of the attitudes that is working within. And, of course, they have all the symptoms that require adaptation from the continual state of preparing energy from the various hormones to prepare to fight or run, and it really isn't being done except in imagination, so they have their share. Now, these two, fear and held resentment, these two states of being, makes up most of the practice of any general practitioner physician. There is fat man and skinny man, whether it's man or a woman, that fills up the doctor's offices because they have the greatest number of ailments, of course, because in the imagination of the not I's that have I hypnotized, it is constantly being reported to X that they're in a very severe condition a great emergency, and X is preparing them constantly to fight or run, and the adaptation takes place, and so they fill up the doctor's office. The fourth level of being in this walking state is anger. Now, that is a state where the one is constantly sticking up for their rights and imagination, constantly feel that they have been mistreated, and that they are entitled to revenge. And they have no fear of getting it, and they're usually rather blunt and rude to most of the people around them. They are quaint drivers, and possibly are what the world calls successful. They have signs and wonders that they have succeeded in improving their situation. They may accumulate properties because they run over everybody. They're entitled to. And they're angry at everyone. And everything they do is very easily justified by the not eyes that says we have been very mistreated and we've got to stick up for our rights. The next level above anger, incidentally, the angry person usually has a pot belly, and that is about it. Otherwise, they're the usual size and shape, somewhat more ruddy complexion than the general run of people, and are quite subject to heart attacks and kidney stones. They don't usually go to the doctor until forced to it because they're angry at doctors like everybody else. And the same as they're angry at their wife, their children, their compadres, their partners, their customers, or whatever. So above the anger comes the fifth state of being in the state of walking sleep, that state of consciousness. This is called boredom. This person has generally achieved a certain amount of comfort, certain amount of pleasure, certain amount of attention, had a lot of approval, and has possibly had power over other people. But it did not gratify, it did not deliver what was promised by Mammon. So the person is quite bored. They're really not very interested in anything, and consequently, they don't do very much. And they don't get in too awful much stress, just enough because they're annoyed with things easily, because what's the use? It's all the same. You'll hear a bored person says, oh, it's all the same thing. I've heard all that before. I've done that before. So he's looking for some specific excitement or something that will pull him out of this deplorable state. Sometimes he turns to drugs, sometimes to alcohol, sometimes to other excesses, but he just looks like it's not very interesting. Life is a big disappointment. The sixth state of being in the walking state of sleep, the waking state of consciousness, is that of contentment. The person has had recently gained certain pleasures, comforts, some idea of security, and feels that everything is quite well. They look quite beautiful. They are not overly concerned with anything because they feel they have it made. And of course, they are not interested in being a student. They are not interested in anything except enjoying their wonderful state they have achieved. They are a success, whether it is success in the worldly terms or success in having attention, approval, or whatever the term may be. They feel that they are quite contented with their state, and why do anything about it? Why try to wake up? Of course, all waking sleep feels they're 100% conscious, 100% free agency, and of course this is why it is a dream. All are working toward an ideal. Now, many times the person in contentment is there for a little while, and then they get bored with it because always is greed that comes back and says we should have more, better, or different. Or they get angry because something happens and they begin to fall from that place. And the highest point in the walking sleep is still an illusion, even though it is called contentment and the person feels they are happy It is a very short-lived affair. Now, in the awareness of self, there is 3 levels of consciousness, 3 levels of being, I should say, I'm sorry. In the self-awareness level of consciousness, there are 3 states of being. The lowest one is vital interest. And you possibly are beginning to discover what a vitally interested state of affairs it is to be able to observe self without identifying with it, without condemning it or justifying. And if you do condemn or justify, of course, that's an indication that one is identified with it. But there is such a vital interest to be able to see it, to be able to see other people without condemning or justifying, without judging them, simply to be aware of them, to be aware that people are asleep. It is beginning to open untold vistas of understanding and being that one has never experienced. So the vital interest state of being is the beginning of being a new person. It is the lowest level of it. But it is like being a new person all over. The body begins to be alert, the face shines, one is vitally interested while one is in this state. Now, admittedly, that at first, as one begins to be aware of the self as an object, without condemning or justifying, this is short-lived. It is a minute here and a few minutes there and a few seconds here, and quite blank spaces in between where one is caught in the identification process and gets identified and falls back into apathy, fear, held resentment, anger, boredom, or possibly contentment. It is very easy to fall into contentment because one feels one has accomplished so much, because one has experienced the state of enthusiasm or being vitally interested in something that one has never seen before in one's life. And with the old ideas of self-improvement, it's very easy to feel I have obtained a sign and a wonder and I done this. But I is only observing. X is bringing about the state of the inner being. The next level of being above vital interest in the state of self-awareness, in the level of consciousness of self-awareness, is exhilaration. Exhilaration is another word for bliss. One experiences a state of bliss, a state of being where there is no conflict, no obstruction. These are very short-lived, generally speaking. If you experience it, you will know why it's short-lived. It is beyond description, except it is in a state of bliss, a state wherein there is no obstruction, there is no sense of conflict within, and in this state one experiences a state of being that passes all understanding. It is short-lived. It comes in places. And then maybe one goes back to vital interest in observing self. If one should identify with that state of being, one is apt to fall way back down the line because one makes it important to continue to have this state of bliss. Or another eye goes up and says, see, you lost it, you goofed. You didn't lose it, you didn't find it, it happened. So the not I is as always a liar, but it will jump up and say to I, see, you goofed, you lost it. And it's all your fault. And if one accepts that accusation from that self-improving I, one identifies with the self-improving I and is already way back down the line, possibly even to apathy. We have seen such occur. Be aware that states of bliss or exhilaration do occur. They are not something one has done, and when it's gone, one didn't lose it. It was just an experience of a certain state of being in the level of consciousness called self-awareness. The next level of consciousness has been referred to as being an artist, experiencing artistic. It does not mean one will start paint pictures, play music, compose music, or arrange things in a different way, or be an interior decorator, or what have you. It merely means that one sees relationships that one has never seen before. Sees relationships that possibly no one has ever seen. Again, it is something one experiences, not something one can do. It is an experience of seeing relationships of all manner of things that one never saw before. And after all, this is what an artist works in, is relationships. So this is called the artistic state of being, and it is the highest level of the self-awareness level of consciousness. Now, beyond this level of consciousness comes, of course, objective awareness, and there is several levels of consciousness in which we will take up at later date. We will not discuss it this time, but all states of being one does not do, they happen as one is in a given state of consciousness, and that includes the lowest ones. Dreams happen in the state of consciousness called sleep. Anger, guilt, fears, resentments, apathies, boredom, contentment occurs in the state of consciousness called walking sleep, where one is identified with an ideal. And if one doesn't have the ideal, one is apathetic, feeling one can never gain the ideal, or one is fearful that one will not gain the ideal, or one is resentful because the ideal was in sight, but you interfered. One is angry because one does not have the ideal. One is bored when one has achieved a level of the ideal, but no more, and one's greed then makes one bored with it. And one is contented when one is gaining some degree of the ideal. But it is sleep that one believes in the ideal of the four dual basic urges, the ideal of mammon, the ideal of the world, and that one can self-improve to the level of gaining these various things. That is a dream state. It's a waking dream. One might say that it is a daydream or a hypnotic dream because it comes from suggestion, from within and from without, and is being in a state of somnambulistic hypnosis, and being aware and observing this from the point of I has awaked and arise from among the dead ideas and is observing the self as an object. So we shall observe these states of being in self. You might write them all down and see how much of the time that one is in these states and how small amount of the time one is in the state of awareness of the self. This gives one considerable material to work with. Sooner or later you will begin to notice, without condemning or justifying, just simply being aware of the states others are in and knowing that the way they behave in that state is the only way they could, because they are in a hypnotic sleep from the hypnotic ideas of the world.